All right, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our small acreage webinar today on raspberries for Colorado below 7,000 feet. My name is Jennifer Cook. I'm the Small Acreage Management Coordinator for the Front Range with CSU Extension and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. With me is Joel Reich. He's a horticulturalist with CSU Extension out of Boulder County. Thanks for being here with us, Joel.
My pleasure.
Before we get started, if you're new to webinars, I'd like to direct your attention to the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. This is the chat box that you can use to interact with us. So if you have questions or comments for Joel during his presentation, you can type your question in the chat box and hit the enter key, and we'll be able to see your question, and Joel can respond to your questions. Probably we'll wait till the end. It might be easier to wait till the end but if you have questions along the way, you can enter them in, and then Joel will just address them whenever you can. And we'll have time for question and answer at the end. So this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Small Acreage Management website probably by tomorrow. And I'll send everybody the link to that as well. Let's see. Before we get started, let's bring the poll up just to find out a little bit about what you know about growing raspberries. If you use your mouse and just click on the most appropriate answer about your knowledge of growing raspberries. And we'll give everyone a few minutes. Probably about good. All right, I guess without further ado, sit back and enjoy Joel's presentation on raspberries.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to all of you who decided to tune in today. This is my first webinar, so please bear with me. I'm used to having a live audience, and hopefully we won't have any kind of speaker errors today. Anyways, this is the first in a kind of a short series of small fruit or just fruit crop in general webinars that we'll be doing. I decided to start with raspberries because I think that of all of the fruits that you can grow here, it is most likely that you will have the most success with raspberries, and there's a whole lot of different varieties. So let's just move right into the presentation here. And by the way, as far as the question box there, the plan is to keep questions until the very end, but if there's something that you're just not getting, I don't want to march ahead with you just lost in the dust. So go ahead and put a question in if you're feeling lost. Okay, so I think it makes sense to start off with the question of, why grow raspberries? Why is it that I'm suggesting that this is a good thing for you to do? So first of all, raspberries are delicious. I don't think I need to tell most of you that. However, it's easy to forget with most of the commercially produced raspberries that we see in the stores how good homegrown, local farm-grown raspberries can be when they can be picked fully ripe, and you can grow varieties that have been bred just for their flavor, not necessarily for having a great shelf life or being able to ship well for weeks from Mexico or something like that. Furthermore, they're also a very nutritious crop. For any of you who pay attention to the health benefits of various foods, raspberries are certainly in the superfood category, especially when we talk about black raspberries. They're right up there with acai berry or any of the other superfood type of fruits. It's also pretty economical to grow your own raspberries. Back to the grocery store experience, if you buy all the raspberries you wanted from the grocery store, you could go broke pretty quickly, I think. And growing them at home, you'll be amazed how many raspberries you can harvest. And then you can, of course, do canning, you can freeze them, but basically you can save an awful lot of money if you and your family are consumers of raspberries to any degree. I also think that raspberries can be a really attractive crop. I know a lot of people don't usually think of food crops as being ornamental, but when managed adequately, especially when trellised, I really think that raspberries can be a really nice element in an otherwise ornamental landscape. I have trellised raspberry plantings in the front yard of my house. I remember neighbors of mine kind of questioning that when I first was establishing those beds. Nowadays, nobody questions it at all. They think it looks lovely because you can have these nice straight rows of very healthy plants that bloom and then have red fruits on them. And so they don't have to be that tangled patch of raspberries that so many people have in their mind. It can be a very nice aesthetic element to a property. I also say here that they're pretty easy. Compared to other fruits, especially compared to tree fruits, raspberries really are pretty easy. The pruning, which I will get into in some detail in a couple minutes here, is not terribly technical like you get into with a number of tree fruits. And even blackberries around here can be a little bit more tricky to prune the right way than raspberries. So relatively easy. And then finally, I have on here that we have a good climate. And I know it's kind of a favorite pastime of Colorado gardeners to lament our challenging climate here. And certainly we do have challenges, but so does every place. And one of the things that's great about our climate here is the low humidity and the low amounts of rainfall we typically get during the fruiting season. That's going to keep fungal disease pressure at a minimum. Just about everywhere else in the world that people are growing raspberries, fungal diseases are the #1 problem that they face. That is just not the case here in Colorado. You've really got to do something really wrong to get yourself fungal problems in your raspberries here locally. Okay, so probably the most important thing that you need to understand about raspberries so that you can grow them successfully is that there are two really different types of raspberries. We have what we call Akane fruiting raspberries and Flora Kane fruiting raspberries. Now you see I've got a box down here that says synonyms. You may have heard one of these terms and not the other, or not understood how they relate. So when we say Akane fruiting, that's the same as the fall-bearing raspberries you've probably heard of. And when we say Flora Kane fruiting, those are the summer-bearing raspberries. And it's really important to understand which kind you have. Before you go planting, it's important to understand which kind is going to work best for you, or possibly a combination of the two, and then choose and plant accordingly. So I'm going to start by just telling you a little bit about the wild origins of raspberries, because I think that's really going to help you understand this distinction between Akane and Flora Kane. So the first records of human beings cultivating raspberries actually come from ancient Greece. The Greeks first started picking raspberries in Asia Minor, what's now Turkey, around the foothills of Mount Ida. And for anybody who has a curiosity about botanical names, red raspberries are known as Rubus idaeus, and that's where that species name comes from, is their early harvesting practices near Mount Ida. Turns out that species, Rubus idaeus, is somewhat circumglobal. Okay, we've got them all across northern Europe, northern Asia, and in northern North America. There's a little bit of debate amongst botanists as to whether the North American raspberries have changed enough to become their own species. Many people consider them a subspecies. Nonetheless, all of those wild red raspberries that we have growing all over the northern parts of the globe, they are all Flora Kane fruiting, or the summer-bearing types of raspberries. And I'm going to explain in a minute where the Akane fruiting ones come from, but I want you to understand some of the structures on these plants, okay? As I think most of you know, raspberry plants themselves are perennial. Meaning that they come back year after year after year and can have a very long lifespan. However, the above ground portions of those plants, which we refer to as the canes, those canes are biennial, meaning that they basically have a 2-year life cycle. And so all of these wild type or Flora Kane fruiting summer-bearing raspberries are going to grow in the following fashion. In the spring of any given year, you're going to have new canes emerging from the ground. Brand new canes. They're going to have thorns on them. They're going to have leaves. They're going to get taller and taller, up to about 6 feet generally, but they're not going to produce fruit. But those very same canes will then go dormant in the fall. They'll go through the winter, and then the following spring, they will flower. And then the following summer, typically in July around here in Colorado, is when they're going to fruit. So they're actually growing 1 year vegetatively, setting their fruit buds in the late summer and early fall of that first year, or their primocane year, or first year cane, right? Then they go through the winter dormant, they come out the following year, flower and fruit. And then once they've fruited, that cane is essentially done. It may not actually die until that second winter comes, but it will never produce anything for you again, and it's basically just going to go into decline. So that is the Flora Kane fruiting pattern for raspberries, where they fruit on second year canes. Now, like I said, that's the typical or original or wild form of raspberries all over the world. But there's a problem with that growth form for gardeners here in Colorado and some other places that have, kind of harsh winters. And that problem is, I mentioned that the flower buds that are going to bloom and then produce your fruit in the second year on those canes, they get established during the late summer and fall of their first year, of their primocane season. And so that means that during that winter, when they have to overwinter there before they fruit, those buds are there on the plant, and there's a potential for them to get damaged. And here in Colorado, what does the damage is not so much the cold temperatures, because compared to many places that grow raspberries, we don't get extremely cold winters here. What happens is the buds can desiccate or dry out because of the extremely low relative humidity we have in the wintertime, coupled with the sometimes very strong windstorms that we get, especially in January and February. So those weather conditions can actually just suck the moisture out of those dormant fruit buds and kill them, such that the following year, the canes may be alive, the crowns of the plant certainly will be alive and producing new canes, but you don't actually get any fruit. So that's obviously a problem, because fruit is why we're growing the raspberry plants in the first place. So now I'm going to take you back on another little bit of a world historical tour, so that you can understand how the primocane or fall-bearing raspberries came to be. Okay. Back in the 1930s, there was an English botanist who was on vacation in Switzerland. And he was there in the late summer and early fall, and I believe it was a September day. He was hiking around in the mountains outside of Bern, Switzerland, and he noticed ripe raspberries growing in the forest in September. And this fella knew raspberries well enough to know that at that time, remember, the only raspberries anybody knew about were the Flora Kane fruiting or summer-bearing types that bear fruit on their second-year canes. Well, this botanist saw these fruits ripening in September, thought to himself, wait a minute, all the raspberries I've ever seen fruit in July. What's going on here? So he looked closer, and he was able to recognize that this wild seedling raspberry plant that he was looking at was actually developing fruits on its primocanes, its first year canes. And he recognized the value to horticulture of this trait that this plant was expressing. And so if we bring this back together with our Colorado challenges, here's where those primocane fruiting types come in. Because if they are fruiting on their first year canes, that means that those flower buds do not ever have to spend a winter dormant exposed to the high winds and low relative humidity where they can potentially be damaged. They fruit the same year they emerge from the ground. So this was really a big breakthrough in the raspberry world. My personal thinking on this is that there were plenty of wild seedling plants growing around the planet that had this fall-bearing or primocane fruiting habit, but nobody who actually understood the value of that had ever stumbled upon one of these plants previously. So anyways, these original plants that were discovered in Switzerland were brought back to Great Britain. They did a lot of breeding work with them, basically hybridizing these wild fall-bearing raspberries with some known summer-bearing varieties that produced really good high-quality fruit. Because as you might guess, those wild primocane fruiting raspberries he found in the forest were not the biggest or tastiest fruits, and they were quite seedy. So it took a number of years, and then in the 1950s, a variety named King George was was released, and that was the first ever commercially available primocane fruiting or fall-bearing red raspberry. And it quickly became the most common type of raspberry to be grown here in Colorado, again, because you could completely avoid what had really been problematic for folks prior to that, which was this winter damage to your fruit buds. So I think that should give you the basic understanding of these two types, right? So the plants themselves, perennial. The crown, the roots, perennial. But the canes are generally, in the Flora Kane fruiting model, they're going to be biennial, growing vegetatively their first year and then flowering and fruiting their second year. Whereas the fall-bearing types of raspberries, also known as primocane fruiting types, are going to grow canes that will flower and fruit in their first year. So anyways, I've got a whole bunch of diagrams and photographs to help you kind of visualize and understand this a little bit further. So let's go ahead and move through to some of those. Okay, so on this slide here, what we're looking at is on the left, we've got fall-bearing or primocane fruiting raspberries. On the right, we've got our summer-bearing or floricane fruiting raspberries. And then as you look down through those three parallel sets of images, we're looking at first midwinter, what these plants would look like before they've been pruned, then late winter after they've been pruned, and then the following spring, okay? And I want you to use these to kind of understand the growth habits. So on the left, the top image, the fall-bearing raspberries, notice those crosshatch marks that I've got there. Those are there to indicate where the fruiting laterals were. The fruiting laterals are the little side branches that actually carry the flowers and then the fruits, okay? So even in the winter, you will see those structures on there, and it's going to show you where that plant or that particular cane has produced fruit. You can see on the fall-bearing types that they tend to produce their fruit along the upper 1/3 of the canes. Sometimes you'll see the upper 1/2 of the cane carry fruit. Then if you go down to the next image below that, you see that in late winter after pruning, there's really no canes left there. There's just stubs. And that's another one of the key advantages to these fall-bearing raspberries, is that because they're going to fruit on each year's new canes, it means you don't need to worry about any kind of technical pruning, or do I prune this cane or not this cane, or where do I cut it? Becomes very easy. You just get out the brush mower or the weed whacker or your clippers and you chop them all right down to the ground, because the following year they're going to produce a new flush of canes that will produce your fruit. And that's what you see down in the bottom image, the bottom left, is the following spring, after they've all been cut down, you have these new canes coming up. Now let's go over to the right-hand side to the summer-bearing raspberries. You can see there that roughly half of the canes in that images have those little crosshatches, right? Because they fruited in the previous season. And you see the other half of the canes don't have them. The ones that don't have any crosshatches there, those would have been the primocanes that had just grown that previous season, and they did not fruit. But as we look at them in this very rudimentary image, they've actually got those dormant fruit buds sitting there waiting for the following spring to start to grow and produce fruits. And if you notice, the ones that did fruit in the year before, so those would have been the floricanes in the previous season, they fruited down more or less their entire length, okay? So if we go down to the second image down on the right, you'll see that this is after pruning. And what's happened there? Well, we've left behind all of the previous season's primocanes, right? Because that's going to be, those will be our fruiting canes this coming season. And all of the canes that fruited the previous season that already have spent their floricane year producing for us, those get cut completely to the ground. And then if you follow on down to the final image on the bottom right, you see that in the spring, you'll have all of those what were primocanes now coming into their floricane season. They're starting to grow those fruiting laterals on the side. Those canes aren't actually going to get any longer ever again. They've grown to their full height in their first season. Now they're just going to have lateral growth with fruits on it. while simultaneously you've got a new flush of primocanes coming up from the crowns of the plant. And so with these Flora Kane fruiting types, you really are, I kind of think of it, visualize it as kind of tumbling over from one year to the other. And each cane stays out there for 2 seasons, but then after each season, you're cutting down half of the canes, you're leaving half the canes, and they just keep renewing themselves like that. Whereas if we go back over to the fall-bearing types, you will see that there we cut them completely to the ground every season, and they come back and fruit for us. So that there is the basics on primocane versus Flora Kane. And we call them summer and fall bearing because the summer bearing types tend, around here in Colorado, we tend to have fruit on them during the entire month of July. Now, as many of you have probably noticed, 2012 has been a bit of an unusual growing season in that we had such a warm spring and summer kind of started early. This year, summer-bearing raspberries generally started bearing around the second week of June and were pretty much finished around the second week of July. So everything's just a bit early this year. We've also got our fall-bearing raspberries that normally wouldn't start bearing until early mid-August. We saw many of them starting to bear ripe fruit in the last week of July already this year. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next slide. Okay, so as I was talking about those primocane and floricane types and summer bearing and fall bearing, I'm sure there are some of you out there thinking, well, wait a minute, I know I've heard about ever-bearing raspberries. What exactly is an ever-bearing raspberry, and when's he going to talk about that? And, well, that moment has arrived. So the fall-bearing raspberries, okay, or the primocane fruiting types, they are the ones that if you prune them in a particular way, you can manage them to get an early and a late, or a summer and a fall crop out of those same plants. So this slide here is going to explain how you would do that. And remember that the key thing here to keep in mind for what I call this split crop on these primocane fruiting raspberries is that when any given portion of a cane has fruited, it is never going to fruit again. But the unfruited portion of a cane, for instance, if you remember back to this image on this last slide here, at the top on the left, you see that those fall-bearing raspberries, they only produced on the top third of their canes. Well, going back to this slide, if instead of mowing that whole row down, we had just individually pruned each of those canes just below, maybe 1 or 2 nodes below where the lowest fruits were, then, and we let those canes go through the winter, the following spring, they're going to act just like a floricane type raspberry, and they're going to produce fruiting laterals and fruit generally in July on those lower 2/3 of the canes that were left over from the previous year. Simultaneously, you've got a new batch of primocanes coming up that will fruit near their tips late in the summer and in the fall. Okay, so let's just look at the diagram for a moment. On the left, on the upper side, so this is in a typical July, primocane fruiting types. If you had completely mowed them down, this is what they'd look like. You'd have a bunch of vegetative canes that have not really started yet to produce their flowers or fruit. In about late July is when they're going to start producing flowers, and then the fruit will ripen sometime between mid-August, then continuing really on until you get a hard frost in the winter. And by hard frost, I mean something below 28 degrees. Now, if you look down at the lower image on the left-hand side, that's intended to depict what July will look like in your patch if you have chosen to do the split crop pruning, okay? And if you see, there are 4 kind of lower, shorter canes there that have fruits on them. Those would have been the ones that fruited on their upper portions the previous fall. Then they were pruned down roughly halfway, and now this following spring, they're flowering and fruiting in July. Simultaneously, you've still got a flush of primocanes coming up that are going to flower and fruit just like the ones in the upper image will. Now, one thing I should mention here, there is no such thing as a free lunch, and there is not a way to get your plants to double their overall yield. So you should really think about each plant as having a given annual total production capacity. And you can either, with these primocane fruiting types, you can either choose to take that entire crop in the fall by mowing the canes all the way down the previous winter, or you can choose to get roughly half and half. half in July on your bottom half leftover Flora Canes, and the other half on the tops of your new season's Primo Canes. Okay, and then if you just look over on the right hand side, this is just to kind of compare with summer bearing raspberries that have been pruned the way I explained on the previous page. You can see there you've got relatively shorter new Prima Canes that are just vegetative coming up from the crowns, and along the top half of the Flora Canes is where you've got the fruit produced. Okay, so now let's take a look at some photos, because I know short of actually being in my garden with me and having me point this stuff out, this is probably the closest I can get for you guys to actually look at this stuff. So obviously this picture, the snow in the ground indicates to us this picture was taken in the winter. It was actually taken in February, so relatively late winter after I had already done my pruning. And the two rows that you see there kind of on the left half of the screen, those are rows where there are primocane fruiting or fall-bearing raspberries planted, and I manage them exclusively for the fall crop, which is why you see there's no canes there. They've just been cut completely to the ground. If you look further over to the right-hand side of the screen, those canes there that you see are all canes getting ready to go into their second or Flora Cane season, right? So all of those canes, we would have called them Prima Canes in the season before this winter, and then once they come out of winter, we will call them Flora Canes. It's kind of unbelievable to me that nobody's come up with an actual name for what to call them in that winter in between. I just tend to call them adolescent canes for that awkward in-between stage that we're all familiar with. So let's look at another picture here. Okay, so these rows here, actually the one in the middle and the one on the right are the exact same rows as we were looking at in this previous slide here on the left side of our image, but this is just several months later. This is the first week of May, and you can see these are primocane or fall-bearing raspberries, and this is the new flush of primocanes. Those primocanes will produce your fruit later in the season. Notice there are no existing canes left over from last year. Okay, now here's another picture. This is the same time of year, early May, but these are floricane fruiting types. So what we're looking at here is you can see all of those canes standing up, and up near the tops, because we're only looking at the bottom couple of feet of those canes, up near the top you can see leaves and growth. Those are all those side branches or fruiting laterals that are just starting to grow that will produce your fruit crop there, because those are second year canes. But notice down along the ground you've got a new flush of primocanes growing up. So those canes down there are destined to grow to about 6, maybe even 7 feet during the season, but they will not have any flowers or fruit. But they're the ones that late in the season, in their first season, will actually establish those little dormant fruit buds so that they're there in waiting to come out the following spring. Okay, here's just another angle on those. This is back in the winter after pruning. What we're looking at here in the foreground on the picture on the left are floricane fruiting types, right, the summer-bearing raspberries, and this is after I've gone through and I've thinned out all of the previous season's floricanes that produced fruit. And so if you look closely, you'll notice that all of those canes standing there, none of them show any leftover fruiting laterals, because of course none of those canes standing there fruited. Those were all primocanes that grew the previous season, and what we see standing there will be the canes that produce our fruit crop in the following summer. And so the two images over on the right hand side of the screen, at the top doesn't really look like much. That's kind of the point. You can see a little bit of weed fabric on the side. You can see the soaker hoses that we were using for irrigation. But what you see are the little stubs of the bottoms of the canes there. That's what a primocane fruiting raspberry is going to look like after you finish pruning it in the winter, as long as what you're going for is to get all of your crop in the fall. If you were going to do the split crop pruning, we would actually still see half-high canes left over there. And then the image on the bottom right, I'm not sure if you all can make it out on your screens, but there's actually a little bit of a flower bud or cluster of flower buds right in the center. You can see those purplish red canes. This picture was taken in late May, So what we're looking at now is near the top of those overwintered canes, which are now in their Flora Kane season, and they are putting out those fruiting laterals, those little side branches that immediately produce flower buds and then lead to fruits in the month of July. All right, here's just another set of pictures to again, let you visualize that. Again, in the foreground of the big picture, we're looking at new primocane growth. This is just a little bit later. We're probably, again, here in late May. And the inset photo is just another shot. Maybe you can actually see the flower buds in this one of one of those fruiting laterals coming off of a Flora Kane. And by the way, the fact that those fruiting buds on a Flora Kane or summer-bearing type of raspberry, the fact that they were established in the late summer and fall of the year before means that when the next spring comes, they don't have to waste any time developing those tissues. They're already there. All they have to do is just expand those cells and expand those tissues, and they're right there. And that's why they are able to produce ripe fruit in July, whereas the primocane types, which have to basically do all of that development in 1 year, don't get around to ripening fruits up until late in the summer and on into the fall. Okay, and then just one last photo here. I do kind of want you to just take a look at the trellising system used here. It is really simple. Basically, I just use T-posts. I tend to use 7-foot or 8-foot T-posts and bang them about 2 feet into the ground so they're nice and sturdy. And then, I'm not sure if you can see it here, but I just use some baling wire at a couple of different heights on the front and the back of each row to basically keep all of those canes nice and upright, because you can imagine when they get all their fruit on them in the coming growing season, they're going to get really top heavy and want to lean over and flop out into the aisles, which one, can make it difficult to work in your garden. Two, it means it can break off some of those canes, which of course you don't want. Okay, so this slide here, and by the way, I should tell you all these pictures that we're looking at, these are all taken in my trial and demonstration gardens that I maintain next to my office at the Boulder County Extension Office in Longmont. And so, it is a trial garden, meaning that we try different varieties out, we see how they perform here, and if they are not good enough, if they're not up to my tough standards, then they get yanked out and replaced with something else. And so you can see here we've got a mature row of raspberries off to the left, but in the middle foreground there we see a new planting. And I just want to point out, I don't know if you can see it in there, but the hoses on the ground, you saw in a previous slide that we had used soaker hoses to deliver the irrigation, and those are nice in the sense that they're very inexpensive and they're very quick to set up, but they tend not to have a very long functional lifetime. The plastic, or I guess it's rubber, that they're made out of tends to break down with UV light over time. And so what you're seeing in this picture here, it's actually more of a brown tube, and this is a relatively new type of drip line referred to as Netafim, N-E-T-A-F-I-M. Basically, it's a drip line that's got the 1 gallon per hour drippers already embedded in it, so you don't have to spend any time fiddling around punching holes and popping button drippers into your drip line. Just wanted to show you that because, certainly drip irrigation, I'm a big fan for water conservation reasons. And it turns out that not only is it nice for us because we can often put it on a timer and we don't have to be out there with the hose all the time, but it turns out that plants love having that regular expectation and knowing when and where their water is going to be delivered. They respond very well. Okay, so I think one of the most important things when you are setting out to have success growing raspberries, or really any fruit for that matter, is to know the right varieties. This is something that honestly I wish more of our garden centers, and especially the big box garden centers, would think about, is variety, 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 and the fact that there are appropriate and inappropriate varieties for any place on the globe you might be. And unfortunately, we see a lot of varieties of fruits around here in our stores that are just not very appropriate varieties. So a big part of what I've been doing at the trial gardens in Longmont for the last 5.5 years is trying to determine what are the very best varieties for us here. And just so you know, the criteria that I use, first of all, it has to taste great. Secondly, it has to be relatively disease and pest free. And also, of course, it needs to be adapted well to our climate here. So this slide that we're looking at right here as far as cultivar selection, these are the Flora Kane types. And so if you think back to my original description of the Flora Kane type raspberries being kind of the original form, I mentioned that the problem with them was that they often incur winter damage, so that the plants might grow fine, but they're not actually producing fruit because those flower buds get killed in the winter. So I've been hunting around to find varieties that taste good and can weather our winter weather with no problems at all. And success. We've had success. Those first two varieties that you see listed there, Nova and Boyne, those two are both excellent, excellent red raspberries. You can see in the picture down there at the bottom, the Nova berries tend to be a little bit bigger than the Boyne berries. The Boyne berries tend to be a little bit softer than Nova when they're fully ripe. However, Boyne tends to have, when I do blind taste tests with people, Boyne usually, for most people, scores a little higher as far as the overall flavor of the berry. Notice I've also got Killarney and Royalty Purple Raspberry pictured down there, and then I've got them crossed off with red lines on the slide. That's because those two varieties both have adequate winter hardiness where we were getting a full crop of fruit every year, but they had other aspects to them that caused me to kick them out of the trial, and I do not recommend these. Killarney, because it has somewhat bland flavor and its growth habit is a little bit less than desirable. Instead of being those nice, straight, rigid canes that you saw in the pictures, it has these really kind of snaky, curvy canes that want to flop everywhere all the time, and it just even makes it difficult with a trellis to manage those. So Killarney got kicked off the island. And then Royalty to the right, I was really quite excited about. It's a purple raspberry. I guess you can't see in the picture how much more purple than red it is, but they are very lovely berries. Unfortunately, they taste terrible. One of the most common comments I get about these when I do the blind taste tests is that it has sort of a diesel taste to it. Now, I don't know about any of you out there, but I do not eat raspberries because I'm longing for a taste of diesel in my mouth. So anyways, we've kicked those out and I don't recommend them. I have heard some anecdotal suggestions that Royalty is a good raspberry if you want to make raspberry wine. I can't really speak to that. Okay, now this next slide here, these are the cultivars that I recommend for your fall-bearing or primocane fruiting types of raspberries. And they're not in any particular order here, but I'm just going to run down the list and kind of describe their merits and potential challenges. So Anne, which you see in the bottom left picture, is a golden raspberry. And I don't know how many of you have had golden raspberries, but they're absolutely delicious. They really never have any of the tartness that sometimes an underripe red raspberry can have. They're just sweet, 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 and they've got a flavor all their own. Interestingly, when you see these in the markets, and they're not all that common, but you do see them, they tend to sell for 3 to 4 times the price of the red raspberries. But here's the funny little trick. They're not any harder to grow. It's just the novelty factor, I think, that allows them to get away with charging so much more. So anyways, I would really encourage you to have some Anne golden raspberries in your garden. Anne is the best variety I've found so far as large fruits, flavorful fruits, and overall total production. There are a couple of other good yellow fall-bearing raspberries out there, such as Fall Gold and Goldie. They just tend to be smaller and softer fruits, not quite as productive. The next one down the list is Autumn Britain, and I will mention that if somebody just had space for one variety of raspberries, I'd probably pick Autumn Britain. It's a very good classic red raspberry flavor, nice big attractive berries, and also it's it's one of these primocane or fall bearing types, and it works very well if you do manage it for that split crop. In most years, Autumn Britain is going to start giving you some of its fall bearing top primocane fruits in the second week of August, and then it will continue like the rest of these primocane types all the way until we get a good frost in the fall, which the last 2 years has been October 15th, although it's not uncommon for us here to get a killing frost in the middle of September either in some years. Okay, the next one is Polana, and Polana is a variety that was developed over in Poland for their industry. You'll actually find that a lot of the dried raspberries you would eat in things like breakfast cereals or granola mixes or wherever, a lot of those raspberries, those freeze-dried raspberries, come from Poland and are probably this variety Polana. Anyways, Polana is a real ruby red fruit, and really the thing that sets Polana apart is its yield. It's going to yield about 150% of Autumn Britain. I tend to use Autumn Britain as kind of my yardstick, and I compare other things to it. So Polana is extremely productive. To do its best, it's also extra hungry. You're going to want to feed Polana about 150% of the fertilizer that you would feed to other varieties in order to really see that increase in production. Now the next one down there, Jacqueline, happens to be my overall favorite raspberry. It's not necessarily the most productive. You're going to get about 75 to maybe 80% of what Autumn Britain will provide, and therefore only about half of what Polana will provide. But I think that the raspberries, and many people agree with me on this, the raspberries are just amazing flavor. They're also nice and firm. They get a very deep red color, and I think you can see in the picture they have kind of a long conical shape, which is also pretty attractive. So do yourself a treat and plant at least some Jacquelines in your garden. Next down, you'll see Caroline. And Caroline, and then below that you see Heritage with a question mark. I should tell you, a big part of what got me into doing some of these trials and research on raspberries was when I first moved back here to Colorado, I was told by a lot of people that the only raspberries you could grow here were Heritage red raspberries. And I've found that they're overwhelmingly the most commonly planted raspberry in Colorado. Unfortunately, I just don't think they're a very great raspberry. You know, they've got good flavor. It's not anything that's, gonna make you cry. It's good. They're not disappointing. But here's what is disappointing about them. They tend to ripen rather late in the season. And so in most years, you end up seeing a lot of your potential crop freeze and die before it gets a chance to ripen up. So as far as I'm concerned, that makes it a not very appropriate cultivar for here in Colorado, and really gave me some of this inspiration to try some of these trials to evaluate some newer and hopefully better varieties. And that's where Caroline comes in. Caroline came out of the same breeding program as Heritage. So if you've had Heritage, if you like the flavor of Heritage, but you just want kind of an improved Heritage that will fruit a bit earlier and have a chance to ripen up all or at least most of its fruits before a frost comes in the fall, I'd suggest you try Caroline. A little bit bigger fruits, little fewer disease problems, and again, it ripens up earlier than Heritage does. Now I think you understand why I've got the question mark next to Heritage. It certainly works, but I really do question whether there's a place for it anymore now that we know about some of these other more varieties that are better suited to our Colorado growing climate. And then the last bullet point I have there is to avoid the varieties Joan Jay and Himbo Top. These are a couple that I was growing in the trial garden, partly because when I looked in catalogs and some of the research papers, it looked like for a lot of the environmental issues that we have here that those would be really good varieties. What I found is that they do not like our intense sunshine here in Colorado, and they tend to get a lot of sun scald both on the leaves and the fruits. So just didn't want anybody else to go down that road because they probably will look very appealing when you see them in catalogs, but avoid Joan Jay and Himbo Top. Okay, so just a couple comments here on managing your crop. So of course you're going to get on your Flora Kane fruiting types, you'll have a July crop. On your Primocane fruiting types, you'll have an August until hard frost crop. Of course, if you grow your Primocane types and manage them for the split crop, you'll have both July and August to hard frost crop on the same planting. And so it just means that we've got, if you combine those different varieties, Primocane and Floricane types, you can have raspberry harvest pretty much consistently from the beginning of July until we get a hard frost. And so just as far as, a recommendation here, if you've got a relatively small space, you're probably better off going with a Primocane fruiting type and managing it for that split crop to get the longest season you can possibly have. If you have a bit more space, enough room for 2 rows of raspberries, that's when I would suggest growing 1 row of Primocane fruiting types, which you mow completely to the ground and get them to produce just their fall crop, and also have a row of summer bearing type, Nova or Boyne would be my recommendations, and let that produce your July crop for you. That way you've got the 2 separate patches, you can manage them differently, and you do get to take advantage of that ultra simple pruning on the fall bearing types. Okay, let's talk about site selection and preparation here for a couple minutes. It is pretty important that you have a well-drained soil for these plants. Many areas in Colorado we've got heavy or very heavy clay soils. For those of you that have sandy or loam soils, don't worry about it. You're not going to need to do a whole lot to your soils. Those of you with the more clay soils, you're going to want to add organic material. That's what the OM is there. And in doing so, you're going to cause those rows to kind of fluff up and be a little bit of a raised or a mounded row. Okay, that's just going to allow for better drainage and better air filtration down into the root zone. Drip irrigation, I mentioned before, I'm a big fan, as are most plants, certainly raspberry plants, and you can apply it and install it either on the ground or above the ground. And the reason you might consider applying it above ground would primarily be if you are growing Primocane fruiting raspberries and you're going to be mowing them all the way to the ground every year or cutting them down. The reason being, if you want to use, say, a fixed blade on a weed whacker or a brush mower or something like that to go through and kind of mechanically cut all those canes to the ground, if you've got drip irrigation lines right down there on the ground, the chances that you're going to nick one of those lines with your tools and cause a leak is pretty high. So what you can always do is, you've got those trellis posts and you're going to have some trellis wires on there. You could hang the drip irrigation line 6 or 8 inches off the ground so that you can still get underneath that comfortably with your equipment to mow those canes down. And I definitely suggest that you install your drip irrigation before you plant for a couple reasons. One, it's just going to be easier to move around and do all of that kind of tinker toy putting together work of a drip irrigation system without the plants in the way. Secondly, it's really important that those plants don't ever dry out. So who wants to be in the situation where you plant your plants and then have to scramble and stress about how to get them watered? Much better to have the water delivery system there first. You plant the plants, turn the irrigation system on, and you're off to the races. One other thing I'd like to suggest that you consider are fertilizer injectors, and you can see those in the picture on the upper right. Fertilizer injectors used to be the kind of equipment that only large farms and nurseries were really able to take advantage of because they were big industrial scale pieces of equipment. In the last several years, we've seen several types of fertilizer injectors come on the market that are geared towards the garden or very small farm scale. And the ones that you see on the top right there are a brand called Easy Flow, but there's also several other models out there these days. And the idea is basically rather than fertilizing periodically throughout the summer by pouring things on or side dressing or top dressing. This way it saves a lot of work, and you just put your fertilizer into those jugs, and then when the irrigation system comes on, it bleeds a little bit of that fertilizer into the water and just gives your plants a consistent low rate of fertilizer, which most plants actually appreciate rather than getting big inundations of fertilizer a couple times a year. And then just one tip, it is best to avoid planting raspberries where solanaceous crops, that would be your tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, potatoes, and tobacco, or strawberries have been grown in the last 4 to 5 years. Just because there's a couple of root diseases that those other plants can harbor, which can kind of give the raspberries a hard time if you plant in there. Now, I realize for a lot of people that just have gardens, you don't necessarily have the space to avoid a part of your garden for 4 to 5 years. Just keep in mind that if you've had disease problems in those solanaceous crops or strawberries, then you'd really, really want to avoid it. You'd probably be okay if you haven't seen any kind of damaging root fungus problems in those crops. But if possible, avoid planting in those spots. Okay, and then weeds, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, and you can always look at the slides here, but basically let me just put it this way. Any perennial crop you're going to plant, it becomes very important to manage your weeds before planting, especially perennial weeds, because unlike a garden or a plot where you've got annual crops, you're going to have a couple, you have spring and fall when you can get in there and till the soil and do all kinds of cultivation to reduce the weeds. Once you get these raspberries in, they're there for a decade or more. So you really want to get on top of those weeds before you plant. And on the slide there are just a few suggestions for strategies that you might take to clean up the planting area before you put your raspberries in. Okay, and this slide, you can think of this as a recipe for the materials you want to use to prepare raspberry beds for a really great organic production in this case. So it's all based on a 20-foot row, and these are the amounts that you would want to put in there. Okay. Composted manure is typically sold in cubic yards, so that's why I use that value there. And sphagnum peat moss is typically sold in those bales that you see. The most common size is 3.8 cubic feet. There's also the 3 cubic foot size that's pretty common. So again, that's why I use that unit of measure there. And then you want to add in some kind of a granular fertilizer to kind of kick off the nutrition in your soil. And again, make sure that the rows are raised for aeration and drainage. And this really shouldn't be a problem. If you look at all of that organic material that you're adding, once you till that into the soil down to a depth of about 8 to 12 inches, you're going to have fluffed up that soil. You've added a lot. So ending up with this mounded row is just going to happen. You're not going to have to work for that much. Okay, now fertility maintenance. The previous slide was how you prep the soil in the first place, but then of course you're going to be taking a lot of crop out of these plantings every season. You need to, of course, replenish the soil with nutrients so that your plants don't become deficient over time. So what I suggest is every year in April, add 1 inch of compost as a mulch on top of your rows, okay? Not only is that going to work well for all the things that mulches do for us, but it's also going to slowly, the microbial activity in your soil is going to basically pull that organic material down into the soil and help keep your soil structure in good shape. And then every year, you're going to want to apply a balanced fertilizer 3 times. And those 3 times should ideally be early May, early June, and early July. The best approach is going to be to use a water-soluble fertilizer and mix it according to the label. And with a water-soluble fertilizer, you can either pour it on from gallon jugs or 5-gallon buckets, or you can use it in one of the variety of fertilizer injector systems that are available. I also suggest every year adding 2 tablespoons of chelated iron per gallon to your fertilizer mix. So those 3 times a year when you fertilize, add some chelated iron. I'm guessing that a lot of you are familiar with iron chlorosis. It's a problem we see in a lot of plants around here in Colorado because of our higher pH. Anyways, the chelated iron is going to help avoid getting iron chlorosis problems because of that relatively high pH. And so once you've mixed this up, your balanced fertilizer along with your chelated iron, go ahead and apply at the rate of about 1 gallon of this mixture per foot of row. And then it's pretty important not to fertilize after July 31st. Once we get into August, the plants really need to start thinking about setting buds for the following year, kind of hardening their tissues off for the coming winter, and we do not want to provide them additional fertilizer at that time, which is going to kind of prompt them to put on new succulent tissues. If you do fertilize after July 31st, what you'll tend to see is more winter damage. The tips of your canes will tend to winter kill because of the cold, so just avoid that. Okay, and here's just a couple recommendations for on the left. This would be if you want to fertilize with synthetic fertilizers. On the right, if you want to use organic fertilizers. So again, not going to spend a whole lot of time there, but both of these products are very, very available locally in stores and online. And as far as the spacing goes, okay, the rows, these mounded rows you're going to create should be 3 to up to 4 feet wide, and they should be 10 to 12 inches wide at the top. So when I say wide, you've got this mound, but try to create about a 10 to 12 inch wide flat-ish strip along the top. That's where you're going to plant, that's where you're going to put your drip lines, etc. Okay. Now, from row to row, you want to have 6 to 8 feet between bed centers. Now remember, your beds are going to be 3 to 4 feet wide, so several of those feet in the 6 to 8 feet distance there are actually taken up by portions of the bed. That's going to still leave you with 3 to 4 foot pathways in between. You definitely want to keep that. Trust me, I'm speaking from experience here. You don't want any less than 4 feet between the edges of your rows, right? Your pathways should be no less than 4 feet. As far as the way you orient your rows, it makes sense to plant your rows in a north-south direction, running north-south. The reason there is you will get more even sun on your plants, right? They're going to get on their east side, they're going to get the morning sun. On the west side, they're going to get the afternoon sun. If you plant your rows going east-west, the south side of those rows is going to get the full sun all day long. The north side never gets direct sun, and you find that the plants can get just a little bit overcooked going east-west like that with all of that full sun on the one side. And you can actually even get a little bit of sunburn on the fruits, which is also referred to as white druplet disorder. You may have seen this where some of the little balls that make up a raspberry, we call them druplets, where some of those will turn white or gray. That's what that is. That's just too much UV radiation on those particular cells, okay? And then when it comes to planting, you want to plant your plants 12 to 18 inches apart. You will notice in most of the catalogs you'd be ordering from that it'll talk about whether the plant is extremely vigorous or has low vigor. So a more low vigor variety, go ahead and plant them at 12 inches. More high vigor variety, plant at 18 inches. Okay, just want to comment real quick here. I don't know how many people out there actually have a high tunnel or have plans for them, but for anybody who's interested in growing raspberries for market, and I know there's kind of increasing amounts of interest in that right now, you should consider a high tunnel. These are basically 3-season growing structures. They're not technically a greenhouse because they're not a 4-season completely environmentally controlled structure, but these work very well, especially for the fall-bearing raspberries. You can really manipulate when the fruiting season is with these, and you also tend to double the crop yields, and you can have a lot less pest damage inside these high tunnels. So anyways, if you're thinking about a commercial endeavor, you could feel free to get in touch with me at some other time, and we can talk about how you could utilize these high tunnels to good effect. And then the last slide I want to show you guys today before I take some questions is this one here. It's a really great publication put out by some of our colleagues at the Natural Resource Agriculture and Engineering Service of Cooperative Extension based out of Cornell University in Ithaca. And you can see the contact information on there. I believe this costs, it's about $20, might be $18, it might be $22, but it's really invaluable. It's designed for commercial growers, anywhere from a small U-pick operation up to a couple 100-acre larger commercial operation, but all the facts in there are applicable as well to a home garden or a small farm here in Colorado. So I really recommend this if you want to get serious about producing really great raspberries and also blackberries. And then the last thing, I guess I lied, I said the other one was my last slide, but I've got to put a plug in here for an event that I think if you were interested enough in raspberries to sit in on this webinar, you probably will find fascinating an event I'm planning for February 23rd this next year called the Front Range Fruit Growing Symposium. It's going to be located in the Longmont. We're still settling on exactly which venue, but it's going to be a day-long event dedicated completely to growing grapefruit here in our Front Range, eastern Colorado climate and soils. I will be giving a couple of talks, but I've also got some really great other people coming to talk at this event. We've got faculty from CSU, but also really important, I've got some local commercial growers who actually grow these crops as a business here locally. So I think there's going to be a lot to learn from that. Should be a really fun afternoon, or I'm sorry, morning and afternoon. And I hope some of you can make it. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Joel.
Yeah.
Let's do the poll question real quick in case some of you have to log off and won't be able to stick around for questions, because I saw a lot of questions coming in, so we might be here for a few extra
I saw that.
minutes.
And by the way, all of you should know, I'm happy to stay here until the questions are done. You all don't need to feel obligated to stay on if you need to go someplace.
All right, so before you leave, please just go ahead and give us your input on how much you feel you've learned from Joel's presentation. And Joel, while we're waiting, so if someone wanted to go to the symposium, could they just contact you to get on an email list? Or?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Jennifer. That would be exactly the thing to do. My email is jreich@bouldercounty.org. Also, if you're needing to find me and you can't remember that, if you go to Google and enter Joel Horticulture, I'll come up and you can find my extension page there very easily. So, for any of you that have follow-on questions about this, need some consulting help for a farm you're putting together, anything like that, or interest about the symposium, just go ahead and get in touch with me.
Good. And we put his address in the little chat box there so you can see it listed. So I guess from here we can just start attacking some of these questions.
Sure.
Do you want to just read them out loud and then answer them?
I'll go for it. Okay, so first question here, is there a spray that coats the plant and keeps the moisture in during the winter dry weather? Great question, one that I've asked myself. And there are some products. I'm actually in the midst of doing some trials on that. I started last winter and will be continuing for the next couple winters. But there's a group of products out there called anti-transpirants. And where you'll often find these used is on Christmas trees and wreath materials. If you can think about that, people are cutting these plants down, cutting them off of their root system, but then wanting them to not turn brown and drop all their needles in your house right away. And so they'll spray these anti-transpirants on that do just that. They kind of are a waxy coating that tends to plug up the stomata and keep the moisture in the plants. I have been looking at that on some crops around here, like peach trees and blueberries that get a lot of this desiccation. I believe that those would work on the raspberries as well. However, my approach with the raspberries has been more to look for varieties that don't need winter protection. So for instance, Nova and Boyne, even though they're the Flora Kane fruiting types, you do not need to give them any kind of protection. You'll hear about people who grow raspberries or blackberries and they have to take them down off the trellis, lay them on the ground, mulch them under 6 inches of mulch every year, then pull them back out in the spring. From my perspective, that is too much work, especially when we have great tasting varieties that you can grow without going to that extent. So yes, there are products, like I said, they're called anti-transpirants. The most commonly available brand is called Wilt Proof. It's WILT-PRUF. Okay, next question is, will we be able to get these diagrams? And I'm going to ask for a little advice here, but I believe...
So this webinar is recorded, so if you go back and just watch the recording, you'll be able to see all the diagrams in that way. And I guess if you want them, you can always print screen when you're watching the webinar if you want a specific diagram to use for another purpose.
Yeah, and if you have a hard time with that, again, you could shoot me an email and I could send you like PDF versions of any slides or the entire presentation if you'd like. So the next question here is, which type produces the most fruit, or is it pretty much the same? And so here, they do produce different amounts. Like I was saying, I think of Autumn Britain as being kind of the standard bearer for the fall bearing varieties. And that's going to give you about 1.5 to 1.75 pounds of fruit per foot of row. Okay, so if you've got 10 rows, you can figure you're going to get 15 to maybe even 18 pounds of fruit off of that row each season. When it comes to Nova and Boyne, those two summer bearing varieties I recommend, they yield almost about the same. Their fruiting season is almost identical. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of reason for people to be growing both Nova and Boyne. Choose one and plant that for your summer bearer, and then choose a fall bearer if you've got room for that. Okay, the next question is, I've had a large patch for 15 plus years. Every year in late fall, I cut the canes to the ground. Each summer, I get an early crop, and again in late summer. Sometimes into early October, I get berries again. I don't prune during the growing season. Are these all Akane? Yeah, I believe what's happening from what you've written here is that when you say you cut them to the ground, my guess is, and I'm guessing because this is kind of how it works for me as well, when I cut them to the ground, there's actually 2 or 3 inches probably left, those little stubs. And those stubs have little buds on them. And just like I said, any part of a cane that didn't fruit the previous year is going to fruit the next year. And so I believe what you're getting, and I think what you would find, is that those early summer or July berries that you get are going to be down low, kind of around your shins, because all you'll have is little short side shoots coming out from the stub that's producing those midsummer fruits, and then all of your fall fruits are coming on the top of the new season's primocanes. Okay, what is the average lifespan of a plant? Well, good question there. If everything was just peachy keen and there were no diseases or anything, raspberry plants can live for a very long time. However, under production circumstances, typically 10 years is thought of as the productive life for these plantings. Certainly any farm that's growing these where their paychecks and their mortgages are depending on it, they grow a crop for 10 years, tear it out, usually let that ground go fallow for a season, and they'll replace, put the new planting in someplace else and then rotate back to that original spot once a year has gone by. In the fact sheets, you recommend certain varieties of both Akane and Flora Kane. Where can we find these cultivars in Denver? Great question, because it gives me a chance to talk about something I didn't cover during my presentation, which is that I don't actually buy any of my berry plants here locally. And I should say, I'm a huge supporter of local economies and ABC, always buy Colorado. The reality is, we do not have any nurseries in the state of Colorado that produce fruit plants, whether it be tree fruits or berries. There's not any proper nurseries doing that. So if you buy them here, they've bought them in from somewhere else, okay? And so I really suggest that you mail order all of these plants. There are a number of good mail order websites for nurseries around the country. One that I've had particularly good success with is called Nourse Farms. It's Nourse. You'll also find a place called Hartman's Plant Company, does a really nice job. But again, you can find literally dozens of vendors online who are actually growing these plants in disease-free settings. And what you really want to look for, this is something that Nourse Farms really specializes in, is certified disease-free stock. Because that's what, I mentioned that the average 10-year lifespan, that's what usually makes these plants have to come out after 10 or maybe 15 years, is that they start to just accumulate diseases. Some of them are viruses, a lot of them are viruses that may not even show a whole lot of symptoms, except that they lead to a gentle reduction in your crop yield year after year. So that's another reason why it's not really a very good idea to dig up plants from a friend and plant them in your garden. As much as we all love to share plants with our gardening friends, it's actually a pretty bad idea when it comes to berries. And some of the few nurseries around the state that are selling you plants that they've grown themselves, that's what they're doing. They're digging up plants from an existing patch that they have probably on their property, potting them up, and then selling them to you. So anyways, I encourage you to buy mail order, buy them in bare root. Like you see roses offered a lot of times, all these berry plants are offered bare root, and they ship really well. And by ordering online, you're going to get way better selection. You'll be able to pick all the exact varieties that you want. which is the ones I'm recommending, right? That's what you want. Okay, so is there a list to tell us which types are fall bearing and which are summer bearing? I planted several types, but don't remember if the tag listed them as summer or fall bearing. Yeah, the first thing I would do if I was you is just go to Google and put the name of the variety in. Type in the name of the variety followed by the word raspberry, and then you're going to get a whole bunch of links that talk about that variety, and I don't think it's going to take you more than a minute or two to discover which type it is, Akane or Flora Kane type. I think that's the easiest way. Next question is, I actually found a raspberry plant that was mowed down. It produces canes but very little fruit. For a better plant next year, what should I do to promote the growth, and how do I identify which variety it may be? Okay, so to promote growth, that's a pretty easy one, right? You're going to want to do some of those fertility maintenance things that I mentioned, right? Like, one, make sure it's getting adequate water, and two, give it some balanced fertilizer several times in the early half of the growing season. And then as far as how to identify which variety it may be, that's going to be really tough to get the actual variety. It will be a lot easier to find out if it's a Akane versus a Flora Kane type, and a big part of what you're going to be doing there is just looking which canes are the ones producing fruit and where on the cane are they producing that fruit. Now it says here that you found the plant, it was mowed down, and it produces canes but very little fruit. Right away, that makes me suspect that this is a Flora Kane producing type of raspberry, and because it was mowed down, the canes that you're seeing are primocanes that won't fruit until their second season. So what I'd say is this winter, all those canes that are growing this year, leave them there and then see what they do for you next year. I suspect strongly that they're going to then produce fruit for you. The next question, fertilizer requirements and schedule. Pounds per plant or square feet, chelated iron. Yeah, well, and if you go back and look at the presentation, I did have in there some requirements and the schedule. Basically, what I suggest is that you fertilize in the beginning of May, the beginning of June, and the beginning of July. And I should mention, if you can't get to it on the first day of the month, it's not the end of the world, but that should be your goal that you're shooting for. And then as far as pounds per plant or per square feet, I didn't give my recommendations in pounds of dry fertilizer. I talked more about using liquid concentrate fertilizers. And for that, you're just going to follow the directions on the package. Pretty simple like that. And the chelated iron, again, I do definitely suggest that, especially the Flora Kane fruiting raspberries, I notice, seem to be a little bit more susceptible to iron chlorosis problems. And so that's why you want to put the chelated iron in. It's a way to get iron to your plants, even if the soil pH is kind of high, which can cause difficulties for the plants in pulling the iron that is in our soil. We've got a ton of iron in our soil. Makes it hard for them to get it. So the chelated iron is just formulated in a way, makes it easy for the plants to get it at the high pH conditions. Okay, the next question is, seems like my raspberries never ripened. What could be the problem? Well, I guess there's two things I can think of. One is that winter came and they ran out of growing season and they didn't quite ripen up all the way, and then they got toasted. But I'm guessing that you would have known that was the reason. I'm wondering if maybe these are your summer berry raspberries and they grew and started to develop but then shriveled and dried up. That can be two things. One, if they're really stressed for water, they will do that. But two, there is a virus, and it is a virus that doesn't even have a name yet, which gives you some indication of how much research there is still to do on the viral diseases that attack raspberries. But there's a virus that I've been seeing more and more of around Colorado that the plants look good, they grow good, they flower nicely, and then they set fruits and the fruits just shrivel up and really never ripen. That may be what's going on. Almost always, actually I'm going to say always, when I talk to people that are having that viral problem, I find out that they dug up the plants from someplace else. They did that great sharing with a friend thing, which kind of came back to bite them. So if you find if that's what's going on, I'd really suggest that you just yank those plants and order some new ones from a certified disease-free source. You might lose 1 year of productivity, but heck, you're not really getting any raspberries now. So I think that would be the way to go for you. Next question. Our property had raspberry plants already. Is there a quick way to determine if our raspberry plants are Akane or Flora Kane? Yeah, there is. Basically, wait until September. Okay, if you have raspberries, ripe raspberries in September, and they're on the upper 1/3 of the canes, then you've got primocane types. If all of your fruits are coming in July or this year, kind of mid-June through mid-July, then you've got Flora Kane types. I think that's really the easiest way. And you could always, send me a picture to my email address in September of what your plants look like, and I'd be able to tell you from that if you don't feel like you can determine it yourself. Next question. The grasshoppers love our raspberry plants. Yes, they do. What can I do to protect the plants from these pests so they don't destroy the plants? Okay, couple things. First of all, the good news is most of our crop plants can actually withstand an insane amount of foliar feeding before it impacts the crop yield. Okay, you could lose 25 to even 30% of the foliage in your raspberry canes and not have it impact the amount of raspberries that you get. Green beans are a kind of a well-known, well-studied example. You can have 50% defoliation of green bean plants before it starts impacting the yield of beans that you get. So the first step is don't freak out when you see some of those jagged holes from the grasshoppers. The second thing that you could do as far as treating them, there are some synthetic insecticides that are reasonably effective against grasshoppers, but I don't know that you really want to be spraying those on your ripening fruit. So, certainly you could use them early in the season if you're seeing a large grasshopper buildup before the fruits have set. And of course, you'd want to use something that's labeled for use on raspberries. Or there are some biological controls known as the most common is called Nolo bait. It's Nolo. That stands for Nosema locustae. I believe it's a fungus. It may be a bacterium. Anyways, it basically digests their digestive tract. So these guys get a mouthful of this stuff and it really tears them up and gives them what I imagine would be a horrible stomach ache, and they stop feeding. We do have a fact sheet on that online. You'd want to read up on it because there are some limitations. Basically, you need to apply these poisoned baits that have the Nolo on there relatively early in the season when the grasshoppers are still young. Once they get older, it doesn't seem to work on them nearly so well. I've also seen people making bait stations with this Nolo bait, where usually the Nosema locustae organism is applied to bran, like oat bran or some kind of a grain that the grasshoppers find attractive. You put it in some kind of a cup near the crop you're trying to protect, and it tends to attract them. They eat that first and then die. So those would be some approaches there. Okay, question. When is the best time of year to put new plants in the ground? There's a very absolute answer to this, and that would be the middle of April is the sweet spot. Really, any time in April is going to be good, but the second and third weeks of April tend to be the best. And again, I suggest getting these bare root plants, and just keep in mind with the bare root plants, you really want to get them in the ground certainly within 3 days of them arriving in the mail. So I'd really encourage you to prepare your beds, your planting site before they get there, so that as soon as they arrive, you throw them right in the ground. One other thing to keep in mind, you want to soak the roots of any bare root plants you get for 8 to 12 hours, like the night before planting, just to make sure they're well hydrated. Let me see, next question. I have delicious Flora Kane raspberries that came with my house. They are nearly thornless. Do you know what they might be called? I'm not sure. Both the Nova and the Boyne, neither one of them has particularly nasty thorns, so it could be one of those two varieties. But of course, there are literally hundreds of varieties out there, and I'd be lying to tell you I could tell you for sure what they are. So I'm sorry. I guess you could just call them whatever you want, and probably nobody'd be able to tell you otherwise. Okay, question about recommendations for the control of cane borer. Yes, cane borer is an insect that basically the adults lay their eggs inside the canes, and typically it's in the primocanes. and they lay them near the tip of the cane. Usually it's going to be 5 to 8 inches down from the tip of the cane, and the larvae then bores through the middle of the cane and works its way down the cane. And so what you'll see is those cane tips just wilt and flop over very quickly, very abruptly. And so really the thing to do there is when you see that happening, and most years it's going to be sometime in late May through the third week of June is when you're going to see that tip wilting happen. You want to go and you want to cut that cane off, but you don't even necessarily need to cut the whole cane. You just want to cut certainly the wilted portion, and then you can just, use your knife or clippers or whatever and just kind of work your way down the cane. You're going to find that larvae eventually, and just make sure you cut below where the larvae was, get he or she out of there, and then make sure you kill it. So either smash it or throw it in a bag and landfill it. Don't put it in your compost heap. And really, if you just stay on top of that and you're pretty dedicated, that's generally going to be a pretty good way to manage them. Next question. Will tree fruits be discussed at the Fruit Growing Symposium next year? Yeah, they certainly will be. I'm a huge fan of tree fruits. 2012 has been a great year for tree fruits. And I will very likely give a talk on tree fruits, but I've also got some other folks coming to talk about them, including we here at CSU have a new state fruit specialist. We haven't actually had one on staff for a couple years since Harold Larson retired. And she is based over on the Western Slope, but she will be coming over, and she's going to talk about, we haven't quite settled on it yet, but she's going to talk probably about high-density orchard systems. And this is really the state of the art and how to get the highest productivity out of whatever unit of space that you have using dwarf trees and trellis systems. So there will be that, and probably at least one other, certainly one other and maybe two other talks on tree fruits. And I also have a webinar on apples coming up pretty soon. That one's going to be on August 31st, also noon to 1 o'clock. The next question we've got here, we have 2-year-old plants in clayish soil. What can we do to amend the soil in a pre-existing raspberry patch? Yeah, good question. What I would suggest you do is once those plants go dormant this fall, right, and so they're kind of not actively growing anymore, I'd get in there and pretty aggressively dig down along the sides of the row, right? Don't dig right into the row where the crowns of the plants are, but just adjacent, maybe leave 4 or 5 inches on either side of the middle of the row. Leave that alone so you don't damage all the roots, but then don't be afraid to tear up some roots outside of that area and just dig down there, amend the soils. You could even add some granular fertilizer down in there, and the following spring, when the plants come out of dormancy, they're going to find that nice loose amended soil. They're going to find that fertilizer, and they're going to colonize that area that you have dug up and amended heavily with roots, and I think you'll see a big improvement next year over what you've seen this year. Next question. Assuming that sunlight requirements are at least 8 hours, can you recommend a variety that may do better with less sun? I would agree that 8 hours is probably a good thing to go with. However, and I don't know that there's going to be a lot of difference in varieties between which ones tolerate less sun better than others, but I'll just put it this way. As long as they get about 5 hours of direct sun a day, you're still going to have pretty good production. It won't be as much as if they were getting full sun, but I know a lot of people who are very pleased with the productivity they get from their raspberry patches that may even be on like a northeast or northwest corner of their house where it is only getting that half a day of sun. So I would just go ahead and pick one of the varieties that tastes good to you and grows well around here. Any one of those recommended that I recommended in my presentation today. And
well, I think it looks like someone is typing. Oh, do you make house calls?
Okay. Do I make house calls? I'm actually not permitted to do that by CSU Extension, so I'm sorry. If you are a commercial producer or have any kind of like a business interest in your horticulture, then I can come and do an on-site call. But otherwise, I'm sorry, I'm not permitted. And then there's another question down here. Have you considered incorporating a scion swap at the Fruit Symposium for those of us who enjoy grafting? Holy cow, that's a great idea, one that I love, and I'd like to believe I would have thought of it myself given enough time, but I'll certainly give you credit here, Chris Kennel, for coming up with that one. Yes, now that you've mentioned it, I will absolutely incorporate that. It's a great idea, and I think we will have a session on grafting. I'm actually tempted, with all the topics that people are telling me they want covered and all the great speakers, I'm tempted to actually make this a 2-day event, because I think we have plenty of stuff to do that would keep it very full, including a hands-on workshop on doing grafting, so people could actually go home with newly grafted fruit trees. I think that would actually be a lot of fun. And then question here is, when do we need to prune? What month? Really, with the raspberries, the answer is in the winter, when the plants are dormant. It's not very important with raspberries when in the winter you do it. I generally tend to leave all of my pruning of perennials until late winter. So by that I mean the last couple weeks of February, the first week or two of March. That's really the ideal time to do it. But if you've got a lot of pruning to do like I do, sometimes you need to start a little bit before that ideal window so that you can get it all done before the plants come out of dormancy. Oh, and we've got a vote here for the 2-day symposium. All right, well, that's you and me, so that's 2 votes. We're on our way. Okay, so hey, folks, I do just want to make one other mention of the other webinars that I'm going to be doing coming up. The next one we have is on August 13th, which I believe is a Monday, and that's going to be on blueberries. Blueberries, something not a lot of people have grown successfully, but I've got a trick to make it work. So check in for that one. And then on August 31st, that's when I'll be talking about apples for Colorado, and got some pretty interesting stuff to share with you in that one. So looks like there's no other questions. I want to thank you all for joining in, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. And the webinar is recorded, so I'll send everyone the link. Have a good day.